Chapter 8, The Museum of Almosts. The Mnemosyne archive smelled of cold stone and something older, something mineral, the way caves smell after rain has not touched them in years. Elira moved through the public corridor with her hood up, and her credentials buried 3 layers deep in a forged membrane card, and she tried not to think about how many times she had walked this same hall as herself, announcing herself, her name carrying weight that opened every door. That version of her felt very far away now. Myra was 2 steps behind her, close enough that Elira could hear the faint catch in her breathing, the soft labor of lungs still adjusting to the archive's pressurized interior after a lifetime in the thin, grit-laced air of the underbelly. The girl had said almost nothing since they'd passed the outer gate. She moved well, though. Elira had to concede that. She moved the way water moves around a stone, finding the angles the security sweepers couldn't see. The public wing closed at the 18th hour. It was now past the 22nd. The bioluminescent strips along the baseboards had dimmed to a blue so pale it was barely distinguishable from the darkness around it, and the automated catalog spirits that usually drifted at shoulder height, offering to assist with queries, had settled into their charging niches along the walls, folded into themselves like sleeping moths. Elira stopped at a paneled door that looked like all the others.
"This is it,"
she said quietly. Myra came up beside her, scanning the frame with the quick, practiced eye of someone used to reading structures for where they were weak.
No light sensor above the hinges like the last one. There's a pressure plate in the floor, though. 6 centimeters back from the threshold.
Elira looked at her.
I see it in the seam.
Myra said, a little defensive.
The tile's a millimeter lower on the far edge. Weight distribution.
That's
Elira turned back to the door.
correct.
She pulled the membrane card from her sleeve and pressed it flat against the lock panel, watching the color seep from its edge inward, the forged credentials dissolving into the system like dye into water. There was a pause that lasted long enough for her pulse to register it. Then the panel blinked once, blue to amber, and the door gave a sound like a soft exhale. She stepped over the pressure plate with a half step, the precise way she'd learned years ago when she still had clearance to be here after hours. Myra watched her once, then did the same, her body low and balanced, her arms held loose at her sides. The pre-terraform wing. The air in here was different. Not colder exactly, but stiller. It felt like the air in a sealed jar, air that hadn't moved in a long time, that had given up on moving. The archive's oldest holdings lived here. Memories from before the terraforming, before the Sky Islands, before the Mnemosyne Council had decided that consciousness was a resource to be managed. The crystalline cases that lined both walls from floor to ceiling were dark, their contents settled into deep dormancy, and the crystals inside them were faded to near gray, most of them, the color wrung out by a century of slow erosion. But some still held a light. Rose-colored amber, one pale and flickering green near the far corner. Small, stubborn fires. Myra stopped walking.
They're old.
She said, and the word carried something Elira couldn't quite name. Not reverence exactly. More like the shock of seeing something you thought was a story.
Pre-2040, most of them, before extraction protocol was standardized.
Elira moved to the research terminal set into the center alcove, its surface dark. She placed her palm on it.
Before there were laws governing whose memories could be kept and whose couldn't.
So they just took them?
They called it preservation.
Myra made a sound low in her throat that Elira decided not to interpret. The terminal woke slowly, its light a careful amber, calibrated not to spill beyond its alcove. Elira had chosen the pre-terraform wing for exactly this reason. The security protocols here were older, the sensor grid coarser, designed for an era when the biggest concern was physical theft, not digital intrusion. The archive's central intelligence didn't prioritize it for active monitoring. Dead records warranted dead attention. She pulled up the research interface and typed with 2 fingers, keeping the query narrow.
What are you looking for exactly?
Myra settled against the alcove wall, keeping her eyes moving between the terminal and the door they'd come through, a habit so ingrained it clearly required no conscious effort.
A link.
Elira didn't look up.
The gold crystal you found in the underbelly, the neural signature on it isn't random drift. Crystals don't develop that resonance pattern from being shed in a storm. Something seeded it. I need to know what.
You said that already. A.
And you asked anyway.
Myra was quiet for a moment.
I'm trying to understand how your mind works.
My mind works like this.
Alira gestured at the screen.
Step, then step, then step.
That sounds lonely.
The search completed. Alira read the result and didn't answer. The file that surfaced was flagged with an archival tag she recognized, a yellow border that meant it had been quarantined from the active index but not deleted. Someone had wanted it findable, barely, but not found. The date on it was 23 years old. She opened it. The subject header read, VUSS prototype interaction / cognitive resonance anomaly / Lyra, surname unknown / case closed. The name landed in her chest like a dropped stone.
Lyra.
She said aloud. Myra pushed off the wall.
What? And
Alira scrolled. The file was mostly technical notation, the dry administrative language of incident reports, but underneath it was the record of a cognitive resonance event, a term she knew very well because she had spent the better part of a decade trying to make those events controllable. An early version of her mapping technology had been used in a field trial, unauthorized, by a technician whose credentials she now recognized as forged. A child had been present. The child had been exposed to an uncalibrated resonance pulse when the prototype destabilized. The child had not survived. She kept reading. The section on physiological damage was clinical and brief, the sort of language that meant someone had been very careful not to use the word they meant, which was death. And then, in the supplementary notes added by a different hand, subject identified post-incident as Lyra, age 9. Next of kin, one sibling, name withheld per minor protection protocol. Alira sat very still.
Alira.
Myra's voice was different now, not flat, not guarded.
What does it say?
It says a child died.
She heard how her own voice had gone, flat and technical, the clinical reflex that she despised in herself. She made herself say it differently.
A 9-year-old girl, in an incident connected to my early research.
She paused.
23 years ago.
Myra leaned over her shoulder to read, and Alira could feel the warmth of her, the smell of dust, and something faintly metallic, the particular scent of someone who spent time at altitude.
Lyra.
Myra read.
Sibling unknown.
She was quiet, then.
Kieran.
Yes.
His sister.
Almost certainly.
Alira scrolled further, to the technical reconstruction, the mapping of what the resonance pulse had done to the child's neural crystal before it shattered. The reconstruction was incomplete, fragmentary. The technician who had run the unauthorized trial had attempted to preserve some remnant of the child's consciousness, a desperate and ultimately failed gesture, but the attempt had scattered the resonance outward rather than containing it. Pieces of Lyra's memory had seeded the surrounding crystal medium. Gold-toned, a rare valence she'd always known, but she had never traced its origin. She had never thought to ask why some crystals drifted from the underbelly preceded. She thought of Myra climbing the island's underside in the dark, gathering what she assumed was storm-shed debris. She thought of Curran, who had been perhaps 11 or 12 years old when his sister died in an unauthorized experiment using technology with her name on it. She thought of all the years between that moment and this room, and how grief could bend a person's entire architecture around itself, quietly, the way a tree grows around a wound in its bark.
He knows.
Myra said, not a question.
Yes.
Alira closed the file. The amber screen went dark.
He's known all along whose work killed her.
The stillness of the room pressed in around them, and the crystals in their cases held their small, stubborn lights, rose and amber and flickering green, and Alira sat with the weight of what she had just learned settling into her like sediment settling to the bottom of still water, slow and irreversible and absolute. She had built the tool. Someone else had misused it, but the shape of the wound in Curran was her shape, and had always been, and she had never known it.
Step.
Myra said softly, from above her shoulder.
Then step, then step.
Elira couldn't tell if the girl was mocking her or offering something. She suspected Myra wasn't entirely sure either.
We need to copy what we can.
Elira said and sat up straighter and got back to work. Elira worked in silence for 12 minutes, copying files onto the membrane card in careful pulls, keeping each transfer narrow enough not to register as a bulk extraction on the archive's peripheral logs. The amber light from the terminal painted one side of her face. The other side was dark. Myra didn't help. She wasn't asked to, and she didn't offer. She stood a few steps back from the alcove, arms crossed, watching the door. The silence between them had changed, though. It was no longer the careful silence of two people who hadn't decided yet whether to trust each other. It had become something heavier. The kind of silence that only settles after something has been said that can't be unsaid. Curran, his sister, her prototype, 23 years.
There's a juncture access panel.
Myra said eventually, not turning from the door.
3 meters past the main filing rack. I saw the seam when we came in. If anyone comes through the secondary corridor, it leads out through the underduct.
I know the building.
You knew the building before you had to sneak in.
Elira saved the last file and pulled the card. The terminal went dark again, and the room returned to its particular quality of silence, the silence of a place where a great deal had been recorded and nothing was being said. She turned in her chair. Myra was still facing the door. Her profile in the dim light from the bioluminescent strips showed the line of her jaw, the particular tightness at its hinge that Elira was beginning to recognize as her version of composure under pressure. She was 17, this girl. Elira kept forgetting, then remembering.
Come sit down.
Elira said.
I'm fine standing.
I know you are. Come sit down anyway.
A pause. Myra turned, looked at her with the flat, measuring expression she deployed like armor, then walked over and sat on the floor beside the alcove with her back against the shelving rack and her knees pulled up. It was the posture of someone who had spent a lot of time in places where chairs weren't an option. Elira slid off the chair and sat on the floor too, back against the alcove wall, a meter between them. She watched Myra notice this, the deliberate matching of posture, the deliberate reduction of distance, and she watched Myra decide not to comment on it.
You know what he does?
Elira said.
Not abstractly, not the way I know it from files and incident reports.
Myra's arms tightened slightly across her chest.
The way I know it is different.
Elira continued.
I saw the plaza in Holloway. I saw the cascade. I almost didn't get out. But that's not the same as knowing it the way you're knowing it right now, the way it's sitting on your face.
I'm not making a face.
You're making a very controlled face, which is a different thing.
Myra looked at the floor. A small muscle near her eye twitched once, then stopped.
My parents.
She said.
My mother was first, 4 years ago.
She spoke flatly, precisely, the way you speak about something you've had to speak about before, in administrative settings, to people who needed facts.
She went to one of his gatherings in Holloway, one of the early ones before the Unburdened had a name. She'd lost a pregnancy, my sister who wasn't born. She was looking for.
Myra paused.
She was looking for something. I don't know what you'd call it.
Relief.
Elira said.
Yeah, that.
Myra picked at a thread at the hem of her jacket, a small, private habit.
She didn't come back the same. She came back very calm. Very. I didn't understand it at first. I thought she'd gotten what she was looking for, that the grief was just gone the way grief eventually goes.
She exhaled through her nose.
Then I realized it wasn't the grief that was gone. It was everything that touched the grief. My name, Jem's name, our father's name. She was smiling at us like we were strangers who had been very kind to her.
Elira said nothing. There was nothing to say.
My father went after her, to Holloway, to get her back, to make them fix it.
Myra's voice had gone a register lower.
He didn't come back at all.
The crystals in their cases held their small lights. Rose, amber, green, patient and faint.
Kieran told people it was voluntary.
Myra said.
That's what he said at the gathering, according to the people who were there. that she'd chosen to unburden herself. And they all believed it because they wanted to believe it. Because if it was a choice, it wasn't a crime. And if it wasn't a crime, then the thing they were doing wasn't dangerous. And
She stopped.
Jem was 6. I was 13. I found us a place to stay in the underbelly of Kalora because it was the only thing I knew how to do.
The crystal harvesting?
Alira said.
Started then, yeah.
Myra finally looked up. Her eyes in the dim light were dark and very steady.
The thing I kept thinking after. What I couldn't get out of my head. She'd been in pain, my mother. Real pain. The kind that makes it hard to eat, hard to sleep. The kind that doesn't lift after a year or 2 years. And Kieran gave her something that removed the pain. He just removed too much.
Her voice didn't break. It stayed exactly level, and somehow that was worse.
I kept trying to decide whether I hated him for what he did, or whether I understood why she went. And then I realized I could do both, and that the both of it together was heavier than just the one.
Alira pressed the back of her head against the wall. The cold of the shelving seeped through the fabric at her shoulders. Above them, the crystals cast their pale shapes on the ceiling, slow and still, the light barely moving. She thought about a night in her lab 5 years ago. The smell of ozone, the particular high whine of the mapping array warming up, and Sienna sitting in the chair with the calibration crown on her head, asking whether it would hurt, and Alira telling her it wouldn't, with the easy confidence of someone who had run the calibration 100 times before and never once thought to ask whether her daughter was afraid. She thought about the footage she'd reviewed 3 nights ago. Sienna beginning to vanish before activation. The remote access timestamp. The moment she'd realized that the experiment hadn't caused the disappearance, that the disappearance had already begun, that she was, in some configuration she still didn't fully understand, not the cause but not the cause either. The shape of the wound, her shape.
I'm sorry.
She said. The words were inadequate and she knew it and she said them anyway.
Don't be sorry for something you didn't do.
It's a complicated calculation in this room.
Myra was quiet for a moment, then carefully.
The files. Kieran's sister. You didn't build the thing that killed her exactly.
I built the principle. Someone else built the application and used it without authorization and without proper calibration, but it was my design, my mathematics, my name on the foundational patent.
Alira heard her own voice doing the thing she hated, laying it all out in segments, organized, categorized. She stopped.
What I mean is that there's a version of this where I look at the chain and I'm far enough back in the chain that I can feel not responsible. And I've spent a long time finding that version. And sitting in this room right now, it doesn't hold.
Myra turned her head and studied Alira's face for a moment with the frank, unhurried attention of someone who had learned to read people quickly, and accurately because her survival had depended on it.
You think you're like him.
Myra said.
I think he loved his sister the way I love Sienna. I think he watched something connected to my research take her from him. I think he spent the next 23 years building a philosophy out of the wreckage of that, the way I spent the next 5 years building a preservation protocol out of mine. And I think we both told ourselves it was for other people.
Alira looked at her hands.
How much of what I do is about preserving memory as a general principle of human dignity? And how much of it is because I cannot bear for Sienna to be gone? And if I can just preserve enough, map enough, record enough, then she is somehow still here.
And how much of what he does
Myra said slowly.
is about giving people relief from pain. And how much of it is because he needs to believe that forgetting is survivable, that he survived his sister's death by not remembering her, and that if he can get everyone else to not remember their worst things, then what he did to himself wasn't damage, it was a method.
The room was very quiet. Alira looked at her. This 17-year-old girl who had climbed the underside of Sky Islands in the dark, who had pressed her resonance down into some quiet part of herself and kept it hidden because she understood, bone deep, what it meant to have something people wanted to take from you.
You're smarter than you allow people to know.
Alira said. Myra shrugged, but it wasn't a dismissal.
It's safer.
I know.
Alira straightened slightly.
I've spent 20 years in institutions where being the most capable person in the room is useful and being the most perceptive one is a liability.
She paused.
We're not so different in that either.
We're pretty different.
In the important external ways, yes.
The faint bioluminescent strips along the baseboard gave a barely perceptible flicker, stabilizing. The archive breathed around them, its vast, patient stillness.
He's going to keep going.
Myra said.
Whatever he's building, this great unweaving thing, he's not going to stop because we found a file. He's been moving toward this for 23 years.
I know.
And stopping him isn't just about getting Sienna back, is it?
Elira felt the question land somewhere below her ribs. She sat with it for a moment.
No.
She said.
It stopped being only about that somewhere between Holloway and this room.
She pulled the membrane card from her sleeve and turned it over in her fingers.
If he releases the pulse, if he unmakes the memory field across Lumen.
She stopped.
My mother.
Myra said quietly.
She's still somewhere in Holloway. No name, no face she'd recognize as mine. But she's there. And if the pulse goes off.
She didn't finish it. She didn't need to. Elira closed her hand around the card. The thin edge of it pressed into her palm, a small, definite discomfort. The crystals above them burned their stubborn small fires, rose and amber and the faint flickering green, light from before the world had taken its current shape, held in their cases for over a century, insisting on existing.
If I get Sienna back.
Elira said, very quietly.
But the pulse goes off. Then everyone in Lumen loses what she would have grown up into. The world she would have returned to wouldn't be the world anymore. It would be.
She pressed her lips together.
It would be the thing Kieran survived and called peace.
Myra was watching her.
That can't be what finding her means.
Elira said.
It can't only be about finding her.
No.
Myra said.
It can't.
The two of them sat in the cold dark of the oldest wing of the archive, surrounded by the faint light of other people's memories, and the silence between them was different now from any silence that had come before it. It was the silence of two people who have arrived, by separate roads and through different wreckage, at the same necessary place. Myra unfolded her legs and got to her feet, that economical movement, no wasted motion. She held down a hand. Elira looked at it for a moment. Then she took it and let herself be pulled up.
The juncture panel.
Myra said.
3 meters past the rack. We should go.
Yes.
They moved toward the door, and Elira didn't look back at the crystals in their cases. She didn't need to. She could feel them at her back, all those small, insistent lights, all those lives that had refused to fully dim, pressing against the dark with everything they had left.